I'm just going to invite Sister Lily Jichiru to hear your comments as well. At least I know Sister Lily is from the Catholic faith and she's into advocacy work as well. So I'm also keen to hear what your thoughts are on this policy, just your general comments on the policy.
Thank you very much, Evelyn, and fellow prophetic voices. Yeah, thank you for inviting me to share my view about the policy. Maybe at this time I will also put off my camera because the network seems to be a little bit unstable, if you don't mind. Yeah. So if it is okay, let me continue with it. First of all, I would look at the policy as putting together the different religions and faith groups. Now, a conglomeration can only come when members decide that it is necessary to do so. But here is a situation when we have not expressed the need that we need that kind of coming together as a group of faith groups and religious organizations. Religious groups and faith organizations. We have not expressed that. But here is a situation that we need to come together. However, coming together wouldn't really be a problem, but I'm also looking at the traditional African indigenous faith groups coming into this group.
And look down.
Just imagine how to manage all these things together under one organization of the RFO. So we already, as a country, we already have a lot to chew on our plate, and we are looking forward to adding another one. And I'm also looking at religious groups as prophetic voices that act at a situation when need arises. And the relationship between the state and the church is supposed to be collegial. It's supposed to be interdependent, or that of interdependency. So now, if one is to control the other, I don't see the religious freedom coming in place, just as our friend, the lawyer, mentioned it, because our country still observes religious freedom, and we need to observe that. As you have mentioned, I belong to the Catholic faith, which is a religious organized group, but I'm not representing them as such. I would like to give this disclaimer. Much as I serve at the Association of Religious in Uganda, I'm not representing anyone in any way because I never had the opportunity to seek the opinion to represent them at this particular time. So in my own opinion, I would say it is premature that different religious organizations and faith groups be brought together under government. The government has, as I've mentioned, a lot to chew. At this moment, we need one another's support. The government needs our support as spiritual leaders and as prophetic voices to heed. And then we, as faith groups or religious organizations, to be helped also by the government to create a conducive religious or political environment to carry out what we are supposed to carry. And then it is also unfortunate that the government or this platform that is coming up to form one organization of RFO or religious or faith organizations under the directive of the Directorate of Ministry of Ethics and Integrity, that this comes to play when it is really premature, I would say. And also to compare the different faith and religious organizations, to compare them to rebellious or possessed groups like that of Lakwena Alice and then Kony would really not be something called for. I don't think the existing religious groups can become so extreme to the point of disrupting the national unity. So my stand is that I will quote from Mark 12. Mark 12:17, where Jesus says, "Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar." Our state is very clear. It is clearly defined in the Constitution that we cannot mix these two entities of the state and of religious affiliations together. No, it will not work. That's why Jesus, as our cornerstone, upon whom we lean, even upon whom our government is leaning, is our cornerstone. And we are saying, give to Caesar, we shall give to government what belongs to the government, and the government should give to the church what really belongs to the church. Much as we belong to the different denominations, but I believe this move challenges all of us. It challenges all of us. So as Christians, we should stand united and say no to this uncalled for policy that is coming up. Thank God they are still doing investigations, they are still doing consultations. As they are doing consultations, we shall also go on our knees, we shall continue praying so that
the policy is still in its consultative stage. Now, not long ago, one of the comments made by the Permanent Secretary of Ministry of Ethics and Integrity was that the policy is just a guideline. You know, he didn't, in his comments, he didn't understand what the fuss was about those that are challenging the policy, arguing that, you know, it's up to people. It's up to the different religious organizations on whether they want to follow the religious policy guidelines or if they don't want to. So, Simon, from a legal perspective, please help us understand, what is the policy? You know, some people think that it's just a policy. So, you know, you can or you cannot follow it. But then we have others that are very strong about it. So what is the policy? What does it mean? What is its procedure? Should Ugandans have any interest in it in any case? Just enlighten us on that.
Again, thank you very, very much, Evelyn and colleagues. My apologies, let me just on my video. So, I think, first of all, it is a purely gross legal ignorance for a person who holds public office. And I speak that not in a derogatory way, but in a descriptive way, to give understanding to a person who holds a position such as a permanent secretary of a government position, a public office. Because under administrative law, they at least have an obligation, not only moral, but also legal, to give and to represent the right position of, in this context, policy development. Now, Uganda has specific rules of 2013 which guide policy development in Uganda. And the end game of the policy development in Uganda is to come up with a form of perspective that informs the substantive legislation of a country. Let's first talk about the historical context of this so-called discussion of policies not being implemented in Uganda. So you remember that I think it was in 2019, a private member in the Parliament of Uganda moved a private member's bill. This is the MP of from Bale. He's called John Baptist Nambeshe. He came up with what was called the religious bill of Uganda. That religious bill was brought up and it was shot down vehemently by various parliamentarians within that must have been the 10th Parliament of Uganda. Now, having realized that because it was a political move to have a private member come up with a private member's bill. Now, strategy had to be changed in 2023. The government clandestinely wants to use what is called in Uganda, in terms of parliamentary development of policy, what is called a government-generated bill. But that bill must have a basis. And that is the whole point of having all these kind of so-called consultative meetings all over the country. That, remember, under the law, under Article 43, one of the ways you can limit the freedom of worship is in the argument called public interest. But because there is no genuine public interest in Uganda, there has to be the politicization of the matter and also generating apparent public interest to justify. So I have showed you that public interest failed in 2019 because they thought they would use a private member to come up with a private member's bill. So now they're trying to sneak it through the government-generated bill. So to understand the policy discussion in Uganda, you must appreciate that you must appreciate that the implementation of laws in Uganda is not just about implementation of substantive laws which are passed by the Parliament of Uganda. But in the Ugandan context, you have to realize that actually, because of the movement of the political tectonic plates in legal implementation, it is not just about having a law passed by Parliament. But once Parliament has been shut down, as I've showed you the history, the only alternative the government will have to use is, number one, to come up with a government-generated members' bill. But remember, passing of a bill in Uganda could take some time because, you have the first reading, the second reading, then you have the option of, if Parliament chooses not to pass the bill, Parliament can choose to pass the bill forcefully, and it could fail on ascension. The president could refuse to assent, and therefore it is sent back to Parliament, and then, it could become still a bill. But remember, we have a history of how that has not worked, or how it has worked on selective laws. And in this context, you could look at the recent Anti-Homosexuality Act in Uganda. So now, the government will have to lean more on implementing a policy, a desirous policy, through a ministry, through the ministry angle. Because when you look at the formation of our government in Uganda, we have the executive, we have the legislature, and we have the judiciary. So most likely, once the government senses resistance from the legislature, like it sensed in 2019, it will most likely go for the executive angle of implementation, government-generated bill and use of ministries to implement a policy. Now, the policy, once it passes, or if it passes, it will have even much more power, because the ministry has power. It has a mandate to implement policies. And remember, for you to read into the specific context of this policy without generalizing, the policy is being implemented by the Directorate of Ethics and Integrity, which is a department under the Office of the President of Uganda. So you can tell where the balance of power is. The balance of power right now is that there is an intention to have a showdown. So, okay, Parliament resisted this policy. Now we are going to use the executive, specifically the Office of the President, to put up a showdown to show you that actually you cannot stop us when we are determined. So in this specific context, you want to appreciate that, number one, the historical context of the implementation of policies has shown that there is a delicate balance of power, and also there is a forceful emergence of the executive, the wielding power of the executive to be able to implement laws as it desires. So you're having a policy which is, number one, a result of some sort of unrealistic public interest or government-generated public interest. Subsequently, it is being implemented by the Office of the President. And I can tell you, when you look at our legislative, let's say, implementation in Uganda, it is selective, first of all. So most likely, if it is from the Office of the President, it will be forcefully implemented, because the truth is, in the Ugandan context, power lies in the Office of the President. Not only the office, but the person of the president. And you can see that with how other laws have been implemented or not implemented. So it is deceptive to think that, number one, this policy will simply not come back biting. It will just be a simple paper. No, you want to look at who is going to implement it. You want to look at the history. You want to look at the process. And that's what I want to finalize with. The process of the development of the policy is very telling of the underlying interests of this policy. Number one, when you read the public, they are called the guidelines on public policy development. under the Ministry of Public Service in Uganda, 2013 to be specific. Under that, there are specific standards of what good policy development means in Uganda. One of the key tenets is what is called an evidence-based approach. An evidence-based approach means that the government should be able to provide substantive evidence to inform the development of a policy. Now, let's read what is in this policy. When you read the foreword and the introduction of the policy, the government is saying it has done what is called an impact assessment report through holding 50 consultative meetings across the region. So measure that against the population that you want to regulate. So, for example, 75% of Uganda are believers, so they subscribe to a religion. But you are holding 50 consultative meetings of less than 10 people who, in fact, are not key leaders in the faith in Uganda. Number two, you're even violating your own procedural mechanisms of developing a policy. It would substantively mean that if you're developing a policy to implement concerning religion in Uganda, you have consulted not only with the key leaderships, but also with the majority population. There has to be the liberty to put out public calls to participate. What has the government done to the Ministry of Ethics and Integrity? It has selectively chosen who can be consulted in the process. And specifically, you will see that the consultation has not even come to central Uganda. Why? There is a lot of heat in the central region from what they have understood historically. Now, when you look at the process, you look at our history, you look at our implementation, you can clearly tell that this policy is not just a mere policy. And the approach that has historically been taken by the Ministry of Ethics and Integrity has been a deceptive approach. Deceptive to mean that they would hoodwink the Ugandans to tell them the first layer of lies they told was that, look here, this policy is only going to target the born agains and it's not going to target the mainstream religions or the traditional religions. But the name that was given to the policy is the National and Faith Organizations Policy. When you read the glossary of the policy, they describe religion to actually mean traditional faith. So there is a deceptive approach. When you look at, even when you write to them to have audience, I'll give you an example. I subscribe to the ministry of Prophet Elvis Mbonyi. In 2019, the late Father Simon Lokodo wrote to the ministry of Prophet Elvis Mbonyi requesting for audience, actually inviting them to a public hearing. At the time when the meeting had to happen, at Hotel Africana to be specific, the day that was allocated, because I was part of the representation of that team, the legal representation, we showed up at the venue. The meeting had never happened. There was no booking that ever happened. And the hotel said, we don't have any meeting like that. So there is underlying deception. When you look at the nature of the language used specifically currently by P.S. Okello, is a language which is extremely condescending. You know, recently when he was at a meeting at Rubaga Cathedral, I think about Rubaga Miracle Center, about 2 months ago, he was using this arrogant, braggant language that, by the way, we can go on without your ideas and we shall pass this policy. Now, you want to read that language in the context of the language the president has just recently used at the State of Nation address. Remember what one statement he said? He said, it is the time for the blood on the daggers to come out. So you can read that there is a determination of the head of state to see that whatever he wants comes to pass and to be implemented. So it will just be typical hoodwinking. And I'll just finalize with this one example. Last week, the Ministry of Ethics and Integrity called for a special validation meeting of this policy in the eastern region of Uganda in Jinja district. So they have failed to understand what consultative processes mean in policy development. Instead of educating and sensitizing, what they are doing now is to coerce, manipulate, and hoodwink the religious leaders into validating a document they don't even understand. Now that is the final layer and the last nail in the coffin that demonstrates the aggressive measure of deception, manipulation, and total hoodwinking of the Ugandans to fail to understand the policy. So in response, really, the policy will come biting, and the policy is not just a mere policy. As I've showed you the context of this, it could maybe work elsewhere in other ministry agencies, departments, and governments. But in this specific context, I can assure you there is a determination to not even to limit, but to regulate, derogate, and violate the freedom of worship. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. I have a follow-up question from your submission, and maybe I'll have Wisdom answer that. You mentioned that in Uganda, the specific Ugandan context, it appears that all power lies with the person of the president. Now, at least from my reading of the policy, I understand that religious organizations will be under the office of the president. So my question is, what's the problem with that? Because from the comments that are made by the proponents of the policy, it appears that, religious leaders have failed to manage themselves. They always flaunt the idea that there's self-regulation within their churches or their places of worship, but yet there's all this mischief that appears to be happening. We've read all manner of articles, really, highlighting the things that have gone wrong with religious leaders. So I'd like to know from the minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ, as he so passionately stated, what is wrong with religious organizations coming under the leadership of the office of the president?
Thank you so much, Evelyn. There is everything wrong with bringing together all faiths and religions to be led by the office of the president, because now the danger of that, we the Christians have a story in the Bible about the children of Israel in Egypt. When they went into captivity, God used a man called Joseph to protect them, and they prospered while they were there. And the successive kings, or call them presidents of Egypt, always protected the children of Israel because they remember the one Joseph who prospered their nation, and this Joseph was an Israelite. But the Bible says one time there arose a king who didn't know Joseph. Maybe, and when that happened, trouble and tribulation was set in motion for the children of Israel while they were in Egypt. So I am a Christian. Maybe the current president, His Excellency Yoweri Museveni, probably has a soft spot for Christianity. Maybe he's a Christian as he professes. What happens if one day we have a president who is a witch doctor? What happens if one day we have a president who is atheist? That is giving too much power to something that can only be regulated by God. And also to let you know, maybe to go past just speaking faith, let us get into the facts. My friend, the lawyer, spoke about evidence-based, making laws that are evidence-based. When you look at the crime report of the Uganda police, it does not front anywhere as religious mischief being one of the major problems Uganda is facing. Today, religious leaders, of course, sometimes they have fights, they have disagreements, they have quarrels, but we have not witnessed people dying, losing their lives as a result of quarrels between or among religious leaders. Yet we have seen political parties fight and people have lost their lives. I think common sense would tell who should be regulated in this time. Number two, when you look at the profile of religious institutions in this nation, without the regulation that they want to impose on faith and religion, religious institutions are the leading service providers of health and education in this nation. In this nation of Uganda, religious institutions and faith-based institutions have been able to organize themselves and serve and deliver services of education and health over and above what the government has ever been able to provide for the people of Uganda. If, again, still speaking based on common sense, I think we can tell who should regulate the other, because without any form of regulation, we have been able to deliver on that front, and Ugandans are very happy. So I think we need, and like my friend the lawyer said, when you hear the language that is used, even when you read the policy, it has very broad language that leaves a lot of room for manipulation. When you read it, for example, you will not find anything to do with taxation, things that anybody could implement. But in the long run, it gives a lot of power to those that shall be appointed in authority by it under the president to implement every manner of evil they will want to implement against the church, simply because this law gives them the power to do so. One of the things personally that hurts me is, you asked why is it wrong to be regulated by the president. So this policy seeks to establish a board that shall have the final say. If you apply to this board to become a minister, to be certified to be a minister in this nation and to start a ministry, that board has a final say on who becomes a minister and what is preached. And it does not, that the policy does not give room for appeal. So you cannot appeal to any other court against the decision that has been made by that board. So the whole thing is demonic, it is evil. It really, really will subject the church to political will and political maneuvers of the reigning president of the day. That is why it is so evil. It should not even be accepted or dreamt about. This policy should not even be debated in any respected space of Uganda.
Wisdom, I just have one more question.
Yes, please.
Someone would argue that we already, at least in Uganda, we have the Interreligious Council.
Yes.
That brings together leaders of different faiths. So I want to know what is your concern about that RFO board? How different is it, for example, from the Interreligious Council that you have concerns about it?
Thank you so much. Now, when you look at the Interreligious Council, the Interreligious Council, its operations, it does not have authority over the governing of the church. Actually, the different faiths come together there for social causes of humanity and, things like health, education, political dialogue. That is what the Interreligious Council does. This board here seems to form something like an interreligious council, but one that has power to regulate faith and what is acceptable and not acceptable. We are looking at a time now. Let me even say this, by the way, that it appears like this policy is out to attack the born-agains, the Pentecostals, who are, for our international followers, they are commonly known as the Balokole in this nation. Now, it is called the National Religious and Faith Organizations Policy. So it has a national, it is going to affect all religions. So to the Catholics and the Protestants and the Orthodox and the Muslims, a time will come, should this policy pass, where this board will have the power to determine the robes you wear, the priestly garments you put on. Recently there was a time in our nation here when it was debated in the courts of law whether judges should continue wearing the wigs. And a time will come, because this board has the power to debate those things. The Interreligious Council cannot do that because it doesn't have state power over faith, matters of faith and religion. It only has a mandate or a space to operate and reach out on social causes together. It does not even deliberate on matters of doctrine. They only come together for social causes that concern the well-being of the people they preside over in faith.
All right, thank you. I hear you. Right now, I want to bring in Dr. Eva and Michael Swain. I'll start with Eva. Someone watching could be thinking, or for the most part, at least my understanding of how the policy has been portrayed in the media is that it mostly affects religious leaders, and for the most part. So I would like to know, at least I know you're a pharmacist, how come you're seated on this panel today? What are your concerns, or what are your comments on the policy, on the religious policy, for starters?
Thank you so much, Evelyn, and thank you to my fellow panelists for the wonderful submissions that you've made so far. Very enlightening and eye-opening. I'm here today as a pharmacist in the capacity of director of an association of Christian medics called Medics for Faith Association. And as the name suggests, we are a group of Christians in the medical field across various disciplines that have come together to be able to streamline and promote excellence in medical healthcare delivery in the society, but mainly by focusing, modeling, and promoting the ministry of Jesus Christ in the area of healing. And in Uganda, in the healthcare system, in the constitution, we can see that Uganda as a nation recognizes two methods, at least, of two systems in the healthcare delivery. We have the conventional medicine, or what we call the white man's medicine, quote unquote, which is called also allopathic medicine. And then we have the complementary medical systems. And unlike the conventional medical systems where you have trained professionals such as doctors, therapists, pharmacists such as myself, who treat the body with drugs, with surgical procedures, and the like. In complementary medicine, you actually have practices such as Ayurveda, which is Indian medicine, which is based on, it has spiritual connotations. You have reflexology, Chinese medicine, and a few others. So I could say, first of all, that our constitution does recognize more than one way of healing or healthcare delivery to the society. And complementary medical systems actually do have, they are governed by an act. There is what we call a Traditional Medicines and Complementary Medicines Act of 2019. And they do have a code of ethics. They have a code of conduct. So I would say that Uganda recognizes that there's more than one way of delivering healthcare to the society, and it is not always a conventional medicine or allopathic route. So that being said, I would also like to say that the Medics for Faith Association, just like any other a medical practitioner all over the world, we get into the practice by swearing what we call a Hippocratic Oath. And though many countries have tried to edit that to fit the time, to fit maybe a specific geographical region in the world, the original manuscripts, the original Hippocratic Oath, makes a relation between delivery of healthcare and acknowledgement, submission, and accountability to a concept of deity or divinity. So in short, there is a correlation between a person's faith or religious standing informing their morals, their ethics, and the excellence of their medical practice in any part of the world. We know that in medicine and life sciences, we have what we call biomedical ethics. And basically, these inform your limitations as to how far you will go. There are principles that we've heard of about confidentiality, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, bodily autonomy, and informed consent as just a few of the principles, the guiding principles in biomedical ethics. But there is much more that that goes on in the actual delivery of healthcare. And I would say that the religious and faith organizations, the proposed policy that affects the religious and faith organizations it suggests, it seeks to regulate faith. And if that is the case, and there is a correlation between faith and medicine, then there is going to be an effect on the execution and on the delivery of healthcare in the country. I will illustrate this with some two key points. The first one being that because our constitution has acts actually to guide and to acknowledge allopathic and conventional and complementary medicine, you will realize that in the latter, as I have said already, there are spiritual connotations. Similarly, in any religious or faith-based organization or setting, you will have doctrines on healing. That cuts across the Christian religion or Christian faith, it across to the Adventists, to the Muslims, and so many other religions all over the world, not just in Uganda. So in Christianity, where I belong, we have doctrines of healing, and these are premised on the teachings of our Lord Jesus Christ and his earthly ministry. He commissioned a healing ministry, which entailed working of miracles, healing the sick, raising the dead, casting out devils that were linked to illnesses, as we see in the case of the boy with the epileptic seizures. And not only that, he commanded that to all who would believe in him, as a ministry that would continue till the church is lifted off the earth through the rapture. And in the book of Acts, there are so many examples of how faith in the teachings, in the commands, and in the very salvation that Jesus wrought for us on the cross, how this manifested in physical healings. Now we're talking about, in the book of Acts, for example, around chapter 5, we talk about the shadows of the shadow of Peter, just a shadow, passing by the sick. People brought their sick out onto the streets, and his shadow would touch them and they'd be made well. There was the laying on of handkerchiefs to transmit the anointing that was upon Paul and the disciples, that was in still in the book of Acts, upon their sick. And you had various ministrations and the working of miracles. So there are, I would say, non-scientific or non-medical avenues to healing as a doctrine, and actually as something that we see today, not only in Uganda, but all over the world. The vastness of televised recordings of crusades, of fellowships, including those of Prophet Elvis Mbonye, show that there have been manifest healings. And this, when you look at it from the healthcare point of view, it actually makes our work easier because, first of all, the allopathic or conventional medicine has relegated some sicknesses as being incurable. And that is where the limitation on conventional medicine is, because you send people home on palliative care, on morphine, to go and die of cancer, of HIV, and so many other, conditions. And yet there is no limitation when it comes to divine or supernatural healing, right? So there's also economic benefit to the nation. In the 1980s and early 1990s, you have Apostle Deogracius Balabe Kubo, who led a major healing ministry. Now, this was not someone who was medically trained, but had a major healing ministry all over the country in the area of HIV and AIDS. And Uganda was being scourged by HIV and AIDS at the time. So when we look at this, we realize that there actually are avenues of healing that come to people beyond the scope of allopathic medicine, beyond the scope of conventional medicine. And our concern as healthcare workers is that we recognize that we're limited in how much we can augment the body of people. And there is a part of our patients that no surgical blade, no tablet, no procedure of reflexology or chiropractic. There are certain areas in the spirit of people that we as medical workers cannot reach. When you come to mental illness, it's the same thing, So we recognize our limitations and we appreciate the contribution. We appreciate the limitlessness of divine healing that is provided by faith and religious organizations. Now, if the RFO policy seeks to regulate, for example, in one of their clauses, I know that they want to dictate the doctrines that are going to be ministered in the places of worship. If they seek to regulate this, then even the doctrine of healing, supernatural healing, would want to come under, in quotes, regulation. And yet, this is something that miracles cannot empirically or scientifically be explained as they're being carried out. And yet, after the fact, after the miracle has happened, and someone who maybe had a maimed limb or was blind from birth, as we see in biblical stories, and even in day-to-day testimonies, science can actually attest somebody will be x-rayed and there's a new, there are new bones, there's new tissue, there's new eyeballs that have formed where there were none. So science attests to the fact that there is legitimate healings that have happened, and it cannot explain them, but we should appreciate that as something that is a big plus for the nation, a big plus for the testimony of the verity, of divine healing, and also to the fact that just because a few people have misused maybe the gospel, or there have been, lone criminal isolated cases that have been cited as justifications for this RFO. Just because there are a few people, I like what Wisdom said. Those people act in the capacity of being Ugandans. That is not the fault, or there's no reason to attack or regulate people's faith, because in so doing, there's going to be an effect even on people's ability to receive divine healing, and that is going to affect the healthcare delivery. On another point, I would also like to say that people's faith has such a bearing on their ethics and morals as both healthcare providers and even as patients. So patients have the right to be able to choose to consent to receive information on what kind of treatment they're going to get. They have the right to object, to want to ask questions, and even to say, no, in my faith, we're not allowed, for example, to get blood transfusions. We're not allowed to do this and the other. There is the liberty that is actually given by God. It's a God-given liberty. And I believe we have, for example, the Universal Declaration of Biomedical Ethics and Human Rights that protects these, and the Hippocratic Oath mentions that too. But even on the side of healthcare providers, I mean, for example, in Uganda, we know that our healthcare system is basically, it needs an overhaul, but the overhaul does not happen because there's a cyclical repetition of, thefts of government drugs, professional negligence, malpractices. And yet these things are meant to be informed by a person's morals and ethics. And yet these stem from their faith. These stem from their beliefs. These stem from how seriously they take the oath that they made to do no harm and to help patients when they started out their medical practice. The ethics that govern biomedical, or life sciences also protect certain areas which ideally should not be touched, because when you do away with faith, mankind will depend upon their humanity to be able to set guardrails, and yet they're fallible. So areas such as, for example, genetics. In China, we have a case of a scientist who customized twin babies. He was jailed because it's considered unethical. And then I think the Biden administration, the American government intervened. He came out, and now you have a technology that can be used to customize human beings, kind of like the way you customize a car. Or when you go to, for example, in advancements in science, where you have gene editing, we have a technology that has been developed called CRISPR technology. It's a pair of genetic scissors that allows you to cut and paste and edit the gene code, the human gene code, and also in other multicellular organisms. Now, if we do not have faith informing the ethics of scientists to show them that beyond this, you're going to edit the gene code and actually, change what makes people human. If we do not have ethics informing people, and these ethics coming from a person's faith, a person's relationship with God, then I think we're in big trouble, because we have the entire humanity at risk. Medicine is a very sensitive area, and I believe that there is a sanctity of life that it should preserve. And that is enshrined in the Hippocratic Oath. And these are the two areas where I feel regulation of faith will have a negative bearing on the already crippled healthcare systems, not only in Uganda, but in so many countries where people's consciences are seared. I mean, you're depending on the good graces of doctors, of nurses, of professionals. They may be excellently trained as far as the motions of medicine are concerned. However, there is need to have a soul. There is need to have boundaries and know that they are, as the Bible calls it, ancient landmarks beyond which you should not step into trying to usurp the place that God has. And instead, stand back, be dependent, remember that you're accountable to whatever, to divinity, whatever your principle and your understanding of that is, that you are going to be accountable to him, probably more than even other professionals. And therefore, faith should not be touched. We should encourage religious and faith organizations to continue to reach out, not just to patients, but even to help strengthen and support the healthcare system. Wisdom mentioned that there's been a contribution by religious and faith-based organizations in the area of healthcare, and that is true. In Uganda, almost every mission church has whether it is Catholic or Anglican, has a hospital just next to it. And you can see there's actually a difference in the value and the quality of healthcare in mission hospitals as opposed to private hospitals. And that comes back to the issue of faith and religion influencing and informing ethics and excellence. So I appeal to whoever is concerned in this area that faith should not be regulated. People should be allowed to grow in that, because it will have a bearing even on us in the healthcare system. Thank you, Evelyn.
Thank you very much, Eva, for that submission. What I pick from your comment is that unlike what we thought the policy to be, it actually does not just affect believers as we know it to be, or religious leaders. It actually extends to professions as well. You've articulately mentioned or pronounced yourself on how this policy would affect medical care. So I'm just before I move on to Michael Swain, I'd like to encourage our participants to share your comments, share your questions. We need to grill these panelists. They need to explain to us why they're taking the stand that they're taking on the policy. So right about now, I am going to invite Michael Swain to join in this discussion, and I'll invite you to just briefly introduce yourself. And we'll kick off from something that Eva mentioned about regulating doctrine. Just after you introduce yourself, is there separation, or should there be separation between religion and the state? Michael, over to you.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the privilege of being invited to speak on this august panel this afternoon. And I believe that this is an absolutely vital topic that you need to be considering at this stage. My role is I serve as the executive director of a South African non-profit organization. We are a legal advocacy organization, and we are called Freedom of Religion South Africa, otherwise known as 4SA. And we specifically exist to protect and uphold the right that is granted in our constitution, which is very similar, I believe, to the one that is granted in yours, to freedom of conscious thought, belief, opinion, and of course, religion itself, faith. That is a foundational right. And when we talk about should we separate church and state, if you like, the answer to that in any democracy worthy of its name is an imperative yes. And the reason is very simple. Freedom of religion is a foundational human right. As has been eloquently expressed by Advocate Simon, it isn't just a single right. It is a basket of human rights. It is not only freedom of conscious thought, belief, opinion, and faith, but it is also freedom of association, freedom of assembly. But very importantly, it's freedom of parents, parental rights, to pass on their faith and their views and their values to their own children. And we have had a number of very significant challenges to religious freedom in South Africa under our democratic dispensation, under the Constitution. And I believe that we have perhaps gone through some very important issues and aspects that you now are facing. And my hope, and the reason why I am very privileged to be participating today, is that we can maybe bring some of our perspective and some of our experience to give you a sense of what happened in our context and how applicable that might be to yours. So I hope that serves as an introduction. I'm not sure if you have any specific question for me, but if you do, I'll take it. Otherwise, I'm very happy to go on and maybe explain some of the context that we faced and some of the challenges and some of the solutions that we were able to find.
On religious regulation.
I'll take that. So continue, shall I?
Have you experienced something similar in South Africa, religious regulation?
Very much so. So when I was listening to the initial presentation by Advocate Simon, it was a little bit like, watching a movie that you've seen before. We had a situation that began in around 2016. We have in South Africa something called the Cultural, Religious and Linguistic Rights Commission. That is set up under our constitution with a specific mandate to protect and promote those three rights specifically, but obviously religion is one of them: culture, religion and language. And what happened, which was really very concerning, was that this commission came out all of a sudden with a report where it suddenly highlighted what it saw as abuses that were taking place in the religious sector. It was a very high-profile campaign that was supported by a lot of media coverage. And essentially what they did was they picked a number of serious abuses that were taking place. For example, there were people who were eating snakes. There were people who were being forced to drink petrol. There was even a situation where somebody was physically assaulted. There was a case where somebody was sprayed in the face with a can of insecticide with a view to them somehow receiving a healing in that way. And they pointed out some very serious money laundering that had taken place. There was a criminal case underway at the time. There was a child trafficking case that was underway at the time. And they used this to basically broad brush the whole of the faith community as a bunch of lawless individuals. And the only solution which they put forward was, of course, that what was needed was state regulation of religion. Now, let me just begin by saying this, that you will probably find, if you do a careful analysis of the examples that you have been given in your context, that almost every single one of them will be covered by an existing law. And the question, therefore, isn't so much do we need more laws to resolve these issues, but we just need proper and maybe timely enforcement of the laws that we actually have already. So that was the most significant thing that we obviously observed right from the get-go, was that there was no actual need for this law to take place to solve the problem that it was supposed to solve. The other question that you have to ask yourself, and maybe just to pull the lens back to a slightly broader perspective, freedom of religion is a foundational human right because it goes to the heart of a person's dignity. Your dignity, your human dignity, is very much contained in what you believe. Religion isn't something that you do in the privacy of your bedroom, and when you leave in the morning, you check it out when you lock the door, and that's that. No, it is integral to who you are. And therefore, the question is, isn't it something that is therefore, and very much so, I would beg to argue, a pre-political right? In other words, it isn't something that is granted by the state. It is something that is simply recognized and guaranteed by the state. And the state, in fact, has a duty to uphold and to protect and to promote that very right, not to regulate it. Here's the biggest problem when it comes to regulation. The question is, who has the power to regulate? Now, we had in this country, and I've heard it mentioned already, a situation whereby initially a lot of the more, let's say, traditional denominational faiths were actually quite supportive of this idea, because in their view, if they appointed, which was proposed in our context, a peer review commission, this peer review commission sounds very similar to your concept, was supposed to then oversee. It was going to be peers from the different faith groupings. Each faith grouping, actually, the Christian faith, the Islamic faith, Baha'i, Buddhist, etc., were all going to have their own peer review committees. And there would be appointees to these committees who would then adjudicate whether or not somebody or some organization's doctrine was acceptable. And here was the problem. Two problems with that when it comes to state regulation of religion. Number one, of course, who appoints the people who sit on the panel? And who do they represent? Whose views do they represent? Now, again, just to backtrack to freedom of religion. Freedom of religion is your right to believe whatever you want to believe without fear, without interference, without hindrance, without sanction by the state or anyone else, obviously, as long as that belief is lawful. So when you're talking about the more extremist issues where people are literally sort of terror groups with some form of religious affiliation, that clearly is a totally different kettle of fish. But when it comes to simply what you believe, our constitutional court has ruled that even if a belief is bizarre, illogical, irrational, and incapable of scientific proof or any evidence, it is still nevertheless protected by religious freedom. In other words, you are free to believe whatever you want to believe. Now, when you start to establish a panel, particularly for a particular faith grouping, and people are appointed to positions to effectively decide what is or is not acceptable, what you're doing is you are fundamentally encroaching on religious freedom, because your religious freedom, as I said, isn't the right to be doctrinally conformative. It is not your right or anybody's right to enforce religious conformity on anybody. That is about as far removed from religious freedom as you can possibly get. And that is deeply problematic. It's deeply problematic, and you can see it throughout all of human history. Whenever you see the state, why is the church and state separate? Why is it so important? Because whenever you see the state putting its power, which is ultimately, if you think about it, the power of the sword, behind any faith or ideology, it is always going to end horribly for someone. And it's very interesting. If you look at the European context, which is where I'm from, I'm an Englishman by birth, and I studied European history, and particularly the history around the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. What you see is you see a new branch of Christianity arising, the Protestant faith in this instance, Martin Luther, with an existing religion which had up to that point been completely unchallenged, which was, of course, the Catholic faith. And Martin Luther comes up with basically a Christian doctrinal interpretation. He was choosing, that's why the word heretic comes from, he was choosing to reject perhaps some of the tenets of the faith of the Catholic Church as it was then being practiced, and he was proposing an alternative. What happened, of course, was that the power of the state that was backing the then dominant faith, the Catholic faith, brought all its weight to bear on or against the Protestant faith and those who adhered to it. And as that faith took root in different societies, then it literally resulted in some of the bloodiest wars that Europe has ever seen. By contrast, even to existing or more recent wars, in one instance, 60% of the population died in one of these so-called wars of religion. Now, you would have thought that once Protestantism was established and once it had now settled its, let's say, the issues of whether or not it literally survived and is now established in other contexts, that they would have learned how awful it was to be persecuted. But lo and behold, you see another expression of Christianity arising called the Anabaptists, and they had a different view on baptism, particularly. And at that point, the Lutherans, who by this stage, of course, now had the political power backing them, literally crushed the Anabaptists as ruthlessly as they had been crushed. People were burned, people were jailed, people were beheaded. And you see it in more modern examples. You may be interested to know that there's an International Religious Freedom Day on October the 27th. And that particular day commemorates the execution of 4 Quakers, known as the Boston Martyrs. The Boston Martyrs, interestingly enough, the Plymouth Brethren, the people who escaped religious persecution on the Mayflower and sailed to America, they established their colony. and they obviously had very strong religious views. And when the Quakers, which was again another interpretation of Christian doctrine, started to come into their territory, first of all, they tried to exile them. And when they refused and they kept on coming, they literally hanged them by execution. And the Boston Martyrs are commemorated. And that is called International Religious Freedom Day. Why? Because whenever you see the power of the state backing any faith or ideology or interfering, it's going to end horribly for someone. The church and the state serve clearly two very separate roles. We've had some examples of that already. But I believe that one of the things that you have to be very cautious of, therefore, is that if the state can control religion, and that's essentially what these peer-reviewed commissions will do, because the state will appoint the people, and the state ultimately will be the final arbiter in some way or another of what is or is not acceptable. What that means is that some people will be shut down and shut out. It also means, by the way, that the state then has control of whatever narrative it wants to decide upon as valid or beneficial. So freedom of speech, of course, freedom of expression, that's very much tied up with religious freedom. And as I'm sure you are aware, and we've heard mention of the prophetic, it is often the voice of the faith community that actually speaks truth to power. It is often the prophetic or the religious community that actually addresses ills or issues with government in a nation because they have that authority. They also, of course, have, apart from political parties, they're the only organizations that have truly grassroots reach and representation. If you can control the voice of the faith community as government, then you have effectively negated its voice. Because as soon as you step out of line, if you are now under the authority of government, and government decides who can and who cannot, then your voice is silenced and shut down, and probably shut down with some form of penalty or sanction, which would be very concerning. So we faced all these situations in South Africa, and the unanimous agreement between all the faith communities, and we're talking about the different faith groupings, ultimately the traditional church groupings, as well as the independent church groupings, as well as the African traditional spirituality church groupings. We had a number of meetings in Parliament where this matter was debated at great length. And again, international law is strongly, strongly supportive of religious freedom as I have expressed it. In fact, I was interested to note that that Uganda has actually signed up for the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It signed that in 1995. And this is very much a reflection of what seems to be in your constitution. This is everyone shall have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right shall include the freedom to have or to adopt a religion or belief of his choice, and freedom, either individually or in community with others, in private and in public, to manifest his religion or belief in worship, observance, practice, and teaching. In other words, it is something which is not confined. It is something which is a very open-ended right. It has a multiplicity of expression. And then it says specifically, no one should be subject to coercion, which would impair his freedom to have or adopt a religion or belief of his choice. This is international law. This is settled law in almost every country on earth. And freedom to manifest one's belief, yes, it says, may be subject to such limitations as subscribed by law and are necessary to protect public safety, order, health, or morals, or the fundamental rights of freedoms and others. But that is in the most exceptional circumstances. It is not the power of the state to just decide what can and cannot be believed. That would be counterintuitive and certainly counter to the spirit of this particular Section 18. By the way, just of interest, in the same freedom of religion clause, it says the state parties to the present covenant undertake to have respect for the liberty of parents and, when applicable, legal guardians to ensure the religious and moral education of their children in conformity with their own convictions. So again, you have to see that this potentially has a profound impact on parental rights, because if the state can decide what is or is not acceptable, it's equally able to decide what is or is not acceptable for parents to teach their own children. So I'll pause it there, but there are solutions. And I just want to say this maybe in closing, two quick remarks. The first is that even though there may be some people who are practicing and, let's say, officiating, they are religious leaders, they may not have the education or the qualification. Religious leaders will tell you almost unanimously, if you ask them, are you doing this because you're educated, or are you doing this because you feel called? And the answer almost every time a coconut is that they feel a sense of deep calling to what they do. Yes, callings should be educated. If you are a Christian minister, for example, it is very important that you study to show yourself approved. That's the scripture that the Bible tells us as an injunction. But it is not something which is a pre-qualification to fulfilling the calling that is on your life. So I believe that it is a fundamental issue of freedom. Freedom generally, democracy, it is one of the pillars of a democracy. When you see freedom of religion under threat, it is a little bit like what's been described as the canary in the coal mine. In other words, the canary in the coal mine was there as a very sensitive creature that if there was a gas leak in a mine, the canary would fall over first. When you see that happening, you must know that there is a very, very concerning trend, which is fundamentally undemocratic, because if you can shut down people's freedom of religion, you're shutting down their freedom of thought, conscience, belief, opinion, expression, association, assembly. These are pillars that hold up democracy. And therefore, it should be seen as very concerning and something which, again, needs a lot of discussion and robust debate so that the right outcomes can be found and the right solutions can be developed. Thank you.
Can be had. Sorry, we have experienced a technical issue with Evelyn, and I'll just wait for her to notify me as soon as she's back. But I just wanted to involve you again, Michael, to get your view. I think just for us to get a commentary on what are the key lessons that Uganda should especially learn from the case of South Africa, because the journey we seem to be taking as a nation will not benefit us. But I wanted us just to get a specific appreciation of the lessons that Uganda should learn from the South African experience as it attempts to have this journey towards the regulation of the freedom of worship.
Well, I think very importantly, you need to be doing what you've done today, which is to actually help people to understand what this actually means in practice. This is not a light issue. It is not something which should just be, oh, well, that's happening and never mind. No, this is a fundamentally important issue. This issue literally, as I said, cuts to the heart of democracy. I believe at the same time, though, we should not necessarily, and we certainly were not in South Africa, just simply sitting shouting on the sidelines. We believe that government does have legitimate concerns and it does have points that it's wanting to make and issues that it's wanting to resolve. But nevertheless, we believe that there should be, at all times, voluntary compliance with the solutions. Because, again, freedom of religion implies the fact that it is voluntary. Is religion, by the way, just as an aside, is it unregulated? The answer is no. It is already regulated. As I think you've mentioned, you have multiple ways whereby organizations, religious organizations can register. You mentioned the NGO Act, you mentioned the Trustees Corporation Act, you mentioned the Companies Act. So there is already a form of regulation. There are certainly going to be other forms of regulations. There's things like employment. If you're employing somebody as a religious organization, you're obviously going to be bound by the legal constructs that govern those areas. Noise regulations, building regulations, you name it. The religious sector is already deeply regulated. And we certainly did not have a problem with registration. In other words, if you are going to set up an organization, then yes, by all means, register it. But the concern comes when you start to involve doctrinal interpretation, or you start to actually consider what is or is not acceptable in terms of religious practice. As I say, as long as it's lawful, as long as it's legal, as long as you obviously can't assault somebody, or you can't steal or rob a bank or whatever it is. I mean, that's ridiculous. But those were some of the examples, by the way, that in South Africa, they were trying to put forward as well. This is why we need to regulate religion. No, it's not. You just need to enforce the law against criminals. So one of the things that we were very in favor of as a solution, and by the way, that's happened widely since we were involved in this matter, is that there was a greater establishment of ministers, networks, and fraternals, again, on a purely voluntary basis. Don't be fooled for these umbrella organizations, because if they're umbrella organizations that are appointed and you have to join one of them, that's not free or voluntary. That's still state regulation of religion. But there are networks and fraternals that obviously help to ensure a greater level of local accountability by religious practitioners. They also, by the way, encourage communities to report criminal activities or wrongdoing in the name of religion to the relevant local authorities. They also provide a very powerful educational component. Through the fraternals, a lot of education has taken place, both in terms of legal compliance and in terms of, let's say, theological integrity. It also gives the possibility, in the event that there's a situation whereby in maybe a local church community, some issue, some dispute within that organization, because again, religious autonomy, the autonomy of religious organizations to decide and to choose let's say the rules by which or within which they operate, that's a very critical element of religious freedom as well, to be able to decide, for example, as many faiths do. They have different interpretations and they have different requirements within the organization. That's a very key thing. And again, obviously, to improve communication, that's the benefit of the fraternals. The second thing, and Advocate Simon, I think sent you a copy of this, and I think that this is one of the best things that we came up with, is there is a religious freedom charter that was developed in South Africa, which took the very, let's say, open clause on religious freedom, which is very short, very generic, and really threshed it out, not in massive detail, but in sufficient detail to cover all the main issues that should be and typically are protected by religious freedom. And that was put in the form of a religious freedom charter. And that is open for anybody to use to adapt to your local context. And we found that very helpful. It was developed by professors of religious freedom law. It was signed onto by almost every single religious grouping in South Africa. Some 22 million people, represented by their senior leaders, subscribed to this religious freedom charter. And then the other thing which was developed was let's say, the flip side of that, which again is very important, which is a code of conduct. In other words, if these are your rights, what are your commensurate responsibilities? Again, this not only is something which is very helpful to actually help to understand what religious freedom is, but it's also, of course, quite telling if somebody says, well, I'm not going to prescribe to that, because you have to ask the question, well, why not? I mean, again, it's very generic, it's very open-ended. But the voluntary, let's say, application is still nevertheless critical. And of course, education and training. Educate your calling. We believe that, just because you are a religious practitioner, yes, it is primarily an issue of calling a vocation and not a result of an academic qualification. But of course, if you don't know what you're really talking about, you can end up doing more harm than good. But again, religious freedom is typically by nature voluntary. If you don't want to, or you don't like what a church is teaching, here's the last time this was seriously debated in our context was 2019. And there was essentially a universal recognition the state must not engage itself in interfering with religious freedom. You'll find typically, by the way, law courts, a principle of law is the doctrine of entanglement. The courts do not like to entangle themselves in situations in law where they're forced to interpret what somebody should or should not believe, or if it involves some belief system, because obviously in so doing, you're going to be infringing the right to religious freedom. Religious freedom, by definition, means that your faith is a free, voluntary thing that you believe, that you associate with others who believe similarly to you, and you should be free to practice and to live out that belief without fear of sanction.
Thank you for that, Michael Swain. Sorry, I dropped off, but I followed the conversation. At least I heard that you were speaking about the lessons that Uganda can pick from any such kind of regulation, from your experience in South Africa and how it has worked, and how you eventually were able to wrap around that issue. So as we begin to close our discussion, I'd like to at least hear from each of the panelists. I've heard your concerns, or we have heard your concerns about the policy in as far as the governance from the Office of the President and religious organizations being under the Office of the President. Our panelists spoke to that. Michael spoke to that as well in the international context. We've had your concerns about the RFO board. We've had your concerns about, regulation of doctrine. So I'd like to hear very briefly from each one of the panelists, and maybe we'll start with Simon. Is there any positive about this policy? Simon, in 1 minute.
Thank you, Evelyn. I think the only way you can answer that question is looking at, number one, where we have come from as a country and where we want to go as a country. So in hindsight, you realize that, for example, we have had a turbulent journey of unnecessary religious fights. So just the other week, we were celebrating the Martyrs' Day, young people who died for their faith and what they believed in. But also that gave you a picture of what an attempt of state regulation of faith can actually do. When you see an overbearing, because you see, it was not the king in that context, the president, so to say, it was not King Mwanga who killed. King Mwanga ordered, but Mukajanga was the overbearing servant who was extremely ambitious to implement what the king wanted. With the emergence of this policy, historically, you will realize that you're going to have an emergence of overbearing leaders and individuals who want to score political points, but without reflecting about the future of the nation. Maybe if Mukajanga had thought about that in that time, he could have done something different. When you think about how our nation has been reshaped because of the Wangereza Wafaransa wars, you get to appreciate how much actually the emergence of religious fights as informed by an attempt by the state to control religious narrative can have far-reaching consequences to the future of a nation. Because even right now in Uganda, there is still massive division based on religious affairs, not because of the existence of religions or diverse religions, but because of the fear and because of the insecurities caused by those who believe in the unfair control of religions. Number two, when you look at it in foresight, you have to appreciate that there has to be, and that's something the panelists have all articulated ably, the body of Christ, the church, is the prophetic eye. And as the Bible says, that once the eye be single, then the whole body will be filled with light. Now, there has to be, the only way you can be able to step into the future and be able to correct any errors that are currently being made is paying specific attention to voices which have emerged specifically on this issue prophetically. And there is, we are not short of references. For example, in Uganda, I think, as we have specifically quoted, when you study, and it's important for all of us who are engaged in this conversation to appreciate specifically the voice, seemingly controversial but very necessary, of Prophet Elvis Mboni, speaking to this issue. Because way back in 2013, when no man had known and anticipated that actually there was an emergence of a plan, you know, to regulate faith, to regulate religion. He stood and he spoke amid strong resistance. Now, it's not just for the sake of the prophecy, but most importantly, it gets to show you the biggest fear of the proponents of this policy. Are they afraid that there is somebody who is seeing their secrets? Are they afraid that there is somebody who is going to correct the future of this nation? Are they afraid that actually there is a true hope that is being raised by an existent spiritual entity in this nation that can awaken the Ugandans? So when you appreciate that prophetic perspective, then you are confident of walking a path which is secure, of consulting. I think there needs to be in all this conversation as a nation. We need to appreciate, we need to have the humility to learn, to listen, to appreciate the counsel that is being given, especially from the prophetic office concerning where we are going. So for you to appreciate the good or the bad of the policy, number one, prophetic authority has told you there is no good in it. But also, hindsight has showed you that we are a bleeding nation because of overbearing forces that wanted to control the freedom of worship in Uganda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. I'm going to bring in Sister Lily, and I'll just speak on something that Michael Swain mentioned, even as you give your take on whether you think this policy has any positive. There's an aspect of the policy which is sort of standardizing religious leaders training. I'd like to hear from you what your take is on that briefly. Can that work? Can a standardization of, training for religious leaders work? I mean, is it even existent in the different faiths? Maybe you could speak for the faith you're more conversant with. And can religious beliefs be regulated in any case? I think one of the panelists made mention of a case, where the court held that you cannot regulate, paraphrasing, you cannot regulate religious beliefs. But I'd like to hear from your thoughts, really. Can it be regulated? Can your inward belief be regulated? Can your outward expression of it be regulated? And what would that mean for you? Do we have
Evelyn?
Yes, please.
Yes, I'm here. I thought you were still referring to counsel. Sorry.
No.
As you rightly mentioned earlier on, as an advocate for social and environmental justice, I cannot agree that religion can be regulated. Basing myself on the fact that a religious person or the religious faith or belief that makes entire person from the heart. In other words, you are what you believe. In other words, so standing on that faith, it is very, very difficult to get maybe a third party to come around and say, now you have to do this way, or you undo this, or we add on to the other thing for you to do well. In other words, putting much more than what you already have, because we are out to streamline how best we can stand on truth, because that is our value. And also we are teaching and helping others to live this truth. And then at the same time, we're also protecting and defending the rights of the vulnerable. Especially in Uganda, we have a lot of vulnerable people. So just see yourself in that kind of ministry, and then some foreign intervention and call for intervention, which is a bit sudden, coming your way. It's like we are ill prepared. I would say I am ill prepared as an advocate for social justice. I'm ill prepared for this policy, which is forthcoming. And then we can only say that This is only possible when it is done in fair and just environment, when consultation is done deeply, and even in an environment of prayer. Because if we are going to use logic, we are going to use philosophy to address some of these things, it will not work. Just as one of the panelists mentioned, we may end up doing more harm than good. And we are saying this nation is still healing, and we need enough time for healing. And adding or introducing other things like this new policy coming up may not help us to do good. Justice may not be, faith may not be doing justice at this particular time, but we are saying we need more time to put into practice the values we have learned from our faith and transmit to others so that we live amicably. Thank you. And before I submit, I think there are some questions. I don't know whether you have taken note of them. Thank you, Evelyn.
Sister Lily, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Is there any specific question you'd like to respond to before we move on to the next one?
I just wanted it to be posted to all of us. I think it was sent to all. One of the panelists said they were unable to see. One is from Rogers. It says, I do agree with doctrinal regulations, but based on the different doctrine in the various faiths, what strategy can be used for a successful implementation? That is raised by Roger.
I want to answer that.
All right. Would you like to give it a shot? Okay.
Is Pastor Wisdom speaking?
All right, Wisdom, you want to respond to that?
Yes, I'm happy to respond to that. I think I don't think regulation of doctrine is possible, and neither is it necessary, because the faith/religious space is unique, and especially in the dynamics that apply to it. And I don't mean this in a bad way, but when you consider for example, the Christians and the Muslims, the Christians silently regard the Muslims as cult. The Muslims as well regard Christians as cult. Now, those are the intricate, the interesting, complex dynamics of religion and faith. Yet, up to now, we have a safe space where we coexist and all live peacefully. Now, if there is already that silent conviction that we are cult to each other, what would happen if you tried to standardize our doctrine and regulate what we can preach and not preach? While you think you're going to create a sense of order, you're going to create a state of anarchy in the state. People will fight because matters of faith run deep to the heart. And man was made by God in such a way that he will fight for what he believes to the end of his breath. So I feel that the state taking a line of standardizing doctrine is a very dangerous thing for our nation, for order and for peace.
All right, thank you very much, Wisdom. I'm going to move on to Reverend Stephen. And one would also be to ask you that very question. What strategy would you propose? And two, what advice, for lack of a better word, would you give to the government regarding this policy? Reason being is that one of the reasons for which it has been fronted is that there is no comprehensive framework for the government to engage with religious faith organizations. So what comment do you have on that, but also a strategy that you propose going forward?
Thank you very much, Evelyn. I don't see a need for a strategy at all, because we can't regulate doctrine it's not possible. Doctrine of the Protestant movement, doctrine of the Hindus, of doctrine of the Muslims, it cannot be regulated by a body, a body coming together and you regulate doctrine or teaching, how you're going to teach people your faith, because we teach from scripture, the others teach from the Quran. So the strategy is difficult, to make strategy for search. So there's no need for strategy. And at the moment, we also see there's no need for policy now to regulate freedom or faith-based or whatever, to regulate faith or religion. What is in place is enough. What is in place as far as the Constitution of Uganda is concerned is enough, because from way before to date, we have had faith-based organizations and religions coming up, emerging, and stabilizing with time. When we started, we in the Anglican Church, we were excited and we made mistakes. As a result, there were persecutions. We were martyred. But the excitement of knowing God, the living God, and reading and understanding, the light that came with the faith as the missionaries were teaching the pages that served the king, excited the pages. And they did some mistakes. There were flaws. And maybe out of these flaws, we had the Uganda Martyrs, part of that, contributed to their death. But as time went on, the Anglican Church, the Catholic faith, and all others, they stabilized. They were able to regulate from within and advance the gospel. So at the moment, I really think that we don't need strategies for to regulate doctrine and all that. We don't need a policy right now to regulate faith-based organizations and show them how they should go. We don't need qualifications, to qualify a minister through a particular trend of or a system of training. What is in place at the moment has delivered good things, and excesses are there, extras have come, flows are there, and these things can easily be corrected from within without having to put up a policy, call the president, put up boards. For me, as far as I'm concerned, no need for a policy, no need for strategy, just move on with what is and advance the gospel. Thank you very much, Evelyn.
Thank you very much, Reverend Stephen. All right, our time is first spent. We have to close. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give their closing remarks, but also a call to action. Yeah, a call to action. So now we know what we know. At least we have an idea of what the policy is about. Some have bought into your arguments. Some, hopefully, they have. So what should be done? What should be done? What do you encourage everyone that has taken time to tune in today or might come across this video maybe later today or tomorrow or any other time? What is our call to action now that we've had what we've had, now that you've shared your stand on the policy? And I'll start with Michael Swain.
Thank you very much, Lee. I think it's been a very interesting and very worthwhile discussion. And thank you so much to everybody for the opinions that you've put forward. I'd like to say a couple of things in closing. The first would be that it is impossible to agree on doctrine. You're never going to agree on doctrine. In the world today, there are some 40,000 denominations of the Christian faith alone. That should be indication enough that there's never ever going to be agreement on doctrine. And therefore, if you then come up with a kind of a one-size-fits-all, then you will be effectively forcing your view of faith on somebody else. And that is the antithesis of religious freedom. So, in a nutshell, I don't believe that any form of state regulation should be acceptable in your nation, with great respect. State regulation of religion equals the death of religious freedom. If the state can regulate you, they have captured you. There is no longer religious freedom in your nation. And as I said, that is a fundamental component of your democracy, because if you can shut down somebody's thought, conscience, belief, opinion, and what they believe in at that level, which is an integral part of their human dignity, then you have effectively removed a vital freedom. And as I think the warning has been given, people take very seriously what they believe. And if you infringe upon their belief at a certain point, you put them in the position, do I obey God or do I obey man? Historically, people have decided they will obey the God however they believe him to be. And that always ends very horribly and badly. So what should you do? I think there's a tremendous unity in the sense that different people from different faith groupings, different faith persuasions are all saying the same thing. You have to educate people what's happening. That's what we had to do a lot. We had to educate people, help them to simply understand the core issues and why religious freedom is so important, and then to mobilize and to get consensus on what it is that you actually want, i.e. you want to preserve religious freedom. You want people to understand it, and you absolutely do not want the state to regulate it. And that ultimately is a numbers game. Politics ultimately is always a numbers game. If enough people stand up and say no, then no will mean no. Politicians, as I say, they look at the numbers at the end of the day. And if enough people are very unhappy about what they're proposing, they will back off. That was our experience in South Africa. And I sincerely hope and trust it will be your experience in Uganda too.
Thank you so much, Michael Swain, and we appreciate you for joining in for today's conversation and for your valuable contribution towards this discussion. All right, next, I'll have Dr. Eva Mugisa.
Thank you so much, Evelyn, for the opportunity and for all the comments. My closing remarks are that I share the sentiment that there should be no regulation or at national basis in Uganda of religious and faith organizations, because once again, as a medic, I absolutely believe that faith and religion informs, in the medical niche, it informs the ethics of practitioners of healthcare, as well as aiding the very practice of healthcare delivery in Uganda, as witnessed by not just the conventional medicine where the practitioners have a conscience and a soul towards their patients, but even by the massive reports of divine healings that have happened beyond what allopathic medicine can do. As an action point, I actually would request that medical workers out there, like myself, in whatever discipline, who are Christian and share the same sentiment towards the correlation between faith and medicine, come out and back this move in sharing their comments on the various platforms that are available. I think there should be a way to communicate with us even after this presentation. I also would like for the government to consider apologizing to the faith-based and religious organization for some of the attempts that have been made to regulate since 2013, 2017. It's been a long journey, but I think it's becoming very, very clear that the matters of regulation are not, the general sentiment is that they're not accepted. And I'd also like to invite, I'd like to vouch for more of the healing testimonies that have happened in the various fellowships, including under Prophet Elvis Mbonye, where I am a testimony of a healing of a kidney accident, an accident that led to a kidney injury, an instant healing shown by medical reports. And I absolutely agree that there's a wonderful role and a wonderful place for faith in the healing area. My closing recommendation is a scripture from Matthew 13. This is the parable of the wheat and the tares. And basically, the message in that parable is what I leave as a parting gift, that we should not try and pull out the quote unquote undesired characteristics or individuals, or any kind of attack towards a religious and faith-based organization on basis of desiring to regulate how they operate and what they teach, because in so doing, even those who are genuine across all religions and all walks of faith will be uprooted as well. And as Wisdom correctly put it, there'll be anarchy. So that's my recommendation. Thank you for the conversation. God bless you.
God bless you too, Eva. Thank you very much. We'll have Sister Lily share her closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Evelyn, and all for taking your time to be with us. Yeah, as my final remark, I would like to say that we continue with this conversation. This is just the beginning. Just as someone rightly put it, that how can we put the proponent of this policy in order within our available parameters? So let us identify opportunities of reaching out to the proponents of this policy and see how we can help them to be put right. In one way or the other, they might also be finding what truth or right is. So we can also help them as members of the panel and others who have journeyed and listened to us in your various capacities. And then I would also call members, all of us, to go in prayer, because this disturbance, I don't want to take it for granted. It could be an attack on our faith. And as someone said, this is how the martyrdom of the Ugandans who we celebrated not long ago started. So we should be on alert. We can't take things for granted. We should be on prayer, on our knees, and invoke God to protect this nation, basing on the motto, for God and my country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sister Lily. I'll have Wisdom K. Peter give your closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. And thank you to all our panelists and our viewers and those that have been listening in all over the world. Thank you so much. My parting shot is a message to His Excellency the President. The Bible says that blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. The Bible still says, I say this to the President because he's a professed Christian, and the Bible also says that believe the Lord your God and you shall be established. Believe His prophets and you shall prosper. Mr. President, there is a prophet in this nation who stood before this religious policy was drafted, and he prophesied its emergence and the fact that it would infringe on freedom of worship. Mr. President, you have a pastor in your household, and I know that you think about these things deeply. And if you will believe the prophet that this policy is rubbish, and you order for its expunging, the nation shall see prosperity. You will prosper, sir. So I also would like to call upon all Christian faithful. We are the majority in this nation. And these politicians hiding in government, they fear numbers. I call upon the entire body of Christ that we stand as one and reject this policy, that it may not see the light of day. Every person, every Ugandan in the army, in the parliament that professes the name of the Lord Jesus, this is evil, and it should not be tolerated, not even debated in any of our august houses in this nation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We'll have Reverend Stephen.
Thank you, Evelyn. My parting shot is we want to see what is it that is exciting these people who are drafting the policy. What is underneath there? What is it that is exciting them? And I would concur with or go with my sister in the Lord who suggested that we need to call prayer, people to pray we need to call each other to prayer so that we can really, come by faith and face this giant, seemingly. And I would like also to say that at the moment, the ongoing conversations, advocacy groups like this one is very healthy to bring, to educate us more about our faith and that which threatens our freedoms. So let the conversation keep going. Let us also find out more. What is it? Where is this rooted to come up with a policy such as this? And I believe that we will then have something delivered that will completely silence this voice that is threatening our freedoms. And finally, we should also hearken to the voice of the Spirit of the living God through the men and women of God. What are they saying? What is it that they are saying from the Lord? As we've just heard, the voice of one who is speaking and crying in the wilderness. So far, we've heard of the prophet who has come with an answer, not only a warning, but an answer. And I think that we need to hearken to the voice of the men and women of God who are saying what they are saying about this policy. As we do that, we will experience a freedom that is above this. That's the only way to transcend this. That's my parting shot. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reverend Stephen. Lastly, we'll have Simon Senyonga.
I just want to extend my sincere appreciation for the opportunity that we have gotten to have this discussion. I personally believe that the discussion is not just relevant because of the emergence of the religious and faith organizations policy, which is being proposed. But I hold a firm view that this discussion is relevant because of the potential threat to the freedom of worship. Now, I am hoping that from this discussion, the nations can get to realize the necessity of having such a valid discussion. Over time, there hasn't been popular conversational engagement around the freedom of worship because it has been presented as non-lucrative. It has been presented as non-progressive. But just because there hasn't been ambassadors who have stood firm to ensure that there is a way that can be created for water in the desert, many have thought that that's not a relevant discussion. But this platform and this opportunity is giving us a chance to amplify the views that are necessary for the progressive development of this nation and also for the globe. And that is why I am persuaded that for every conversation, there's always a centerpiece, a kingpin for those who play draft, for those who, who play sports. You'll always realize that there is always a centerpiece for the conversation. Now, that's the biggest opportunity we have, that at the center of this conversation, we have a voice that has come out solidly to shape the discussion. For those who are, and that voice is Prophet Elvis Mbonyi, for those who are watching, it's a moment for us to reflect that the battle against the religious policy in Uganda has been a consistent battle, but consistently lost. It has been a war which has not been even attempted because we have lost the battles. Now, what is the game changer? Because that is what makes the difference. The game changer is not in how much we speak. It's not in how much we advocate. It's not how much we coalesce together to have some sort of common view. That we have come to realize in our nation does not count. There has to be a coalition around the kingpin. There has to be a coming together around the kingpin. And we have seen a voice that has emerged to give us a perspective which is clear, which is sure concerning the destiny of this nation and concerning how we are going to deal with this policy. So for me, as a lawyer, my worldviews are not informed by how much good education I've gotten from the law schools or the training or the experience. It comes from this solid affirmation that I am anchored in a spiritual authority and voice such as that of Prophet Elvis Mbonye that cannot be doubted. For those who are interested in facts, statistics, history, experience, it's important that we have a keen reflection, because that's what's going to make the difference in this conversation. The church in South Africa stood and they have made a difference, but I believe now is the time for us as a nation in Uganda to stand and make the most use of that which is undoubted. And that will give us the confidence, because the difference between this discussion and other discussions is that many have used the law just to propagate a future they desire, but that has only been a mere shell. Now, in the absence of an authentic spiritual backing, there is no way your coalition, your conversation, your advocacy will take on a higher notch. And that is why, for me, I want to thank the Lord Jesus Christ for the opportunity, and for, most importantly, thanking the Lord for giving us Prophet Elvis Mbonye, who has amplified this conversation and created a sure way, which we are all now towing. And I believe that this is only the start on how much we're going to shake the world, shake the nations with these conversations for the betterment of our future. God bless you, and thank you very much for hosting me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. We've heard from our panelists. A big thank you to each and every one of our panelists. Thank you for your views. What is clear from today's discussion is that there's no need for a religious policy. That is number one. But also number two, what informs that perspective from a good number of the panelists is that there's a prophetic word that came long before the policy was ever heard about. So this is not so much about sentiments, but if we care for the advancement and the prosperity of this nation, Uganda, we do well to give attention to that prophetic direction. I also want to thank our participants on Zoom and Facebook. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I've seen your comments. I could not read all of them, but I've been checking in on the different platforms for your engagement. So thank you so much. Thank you for your patience. Once again, we apologize for the technical glitches, but we're here. We're here, and I believe you have benefited a thing or more from this conversation. This is the beginning of many conversations regarding this policy. We've touched the overview of it, but hopefully we'll get to unpack it and study the different, or examine the different dimensions of this policy and why it actually affects each and every Ugandan. If you want to participate, or if you have any questions, if you have any comments, if you have any contributions on this conversation, but generally as well, religious freedoms, you can send your email or send an email to info@icra.center. So I'll spell that out. INFO at ICRA, which is ICRA .center, CENTER. If you have any contribution towards this conversation on religious freedom, you've been inspired, to join the move of religious advocates, please do not hesitate to share your comments. If you want to feature in one of the discussions on the religious policy or religious freedoms, generally, please do contact that email and you will receive a swift response. As I close, I want to thank ICRAD, International Center for Religious Advocacy and Development, for hosting us today, and for providing a platform for us to discuss this. I will leave us with a scripture. I encourage each and every one of us to contend for our faith. Just like Jude said, contend earnestly for your faith that was once delivered for all to all the saints. When you don't have, or if your faith is infringed upon, you are as good as dead. I can assure you of that. So contend for your faith and for everything that you believe in. or not believe, whatever your belief is, contend for it. And remember, this policy has not come to affect just the Pentecostals or the traditional religions. It has come to affect each and every Ugandan. We have 99% of the Ugandans that believe in something. So remember that. Do not take a back seat. Engage until this policy is dead and buried, never to resurrect. Thank you so much for being a lovely audience. I wish you a great Wednesday evening, and God bless you.